Hi, it's Christina with the Sisyphean Journal, and today we are looking at one of those cases of trust but verify, and we definitely were able to verify. A former abortion entrepreneur, Carol Everett, tells in her book Blood Money how a doctor in one of her clinics sent a woman home to bleed to death over a pitcher of margaritas. So Carol opens her book with the story of a woman she calls Cheryl Mason. Now, at first they thought that Cheryl was 18 weeks pregnant, but she turned out to be 20 weeks pregnant according to the doctor's estimate on examining her. So the clinic held the $375 she'd already paid and gave her until that Friday to come up with another $125. So it was already after 7 p.m. when Cheryl arrived with the extra cash, Carol said. She knew that Cheryl would be in recovery for a long time because of her advanced state of pregnancy, so she moved her to the head of the queue to speed up the process. So after Cheryl's safe legal abortion was completed, Carol met with the abortionist, Harvey Johnson, in the supply room to verify that all the fetal parts were accounted for. And as they verified that, and Harvey ran the remains down the garbage disposal, they discussed their plans for the evening. Carol had a date, and Harvey was going to have margaritas with his girlfriend, Carol recalled. So she went to her office to tend to some administrative work, and Harvey resumed the evening's abortions. Now, later that evening, Harvey called Carol to the recovery room. Cheryl was bleeding heavily. None of the staff had ever seen that much blood. They were all scared, but did their best to calm the patient and get on top of the situation. An aide massaged Cheryl's uterus to encourage it to contract and reduce the bleeding. Carol said, "Harvey and I stepped out to the recovery room to talk. He looked at his watch. I'm leaving to meet Freddie at Ninfa's," he said. "I'll call back, and I have my beeper on if you need me. Cheryl will be fine. Just be sure to keep massaging her uterus until the bleeding stops. When her vital signs are stable, dismiss her. I'll see you in the morning." So this patient is already alarmingly bleeding, and there's nobody with adequate medical training, and he's just going home. And Cheryl attributes his decision to go home with on the pitcher of margaritas waiting for him. So staff cleaned Cheryl up as best they could and brought her boyfriend back to keep her company. Carol finished her administrative work, checked on Cheryl, and then called her own boyfriend to cancel their date. Now, Harvey assumed that the problem, whatever the problem had been, had corrected itself. Carol sat by Cheryl and the boyfriend waiting to hear back from Harvey. Now, Cheryl wanted to leave to go home and be in her own bed. And this is something I need to bring up. One of the signs that a patient is in shock is that they will say they're just fine, they just want to go home, they just want to go to bed. That is a bad sign, not a good sign. You need a highly trained medical professional to double check and make sure that it's not, okay, they really are okay. Because they're at one end of the spectrum or the other. They really are okay, and it's okay to send them home, or, whoa, they are close to totally decompensating here. We need to be extra careful. So Carol was uneasy, but she decided to let Cheryl go home at 11 p.m., admonishing her to call if there was any trouble. So it was Carol, an administrator, who ended up making what should have been a medical decision made by a physician who had left a hemorrhaging patient in the care of untrained staff because his margaritas were waiting. Carol said she was awakened at 6 o'clock the next morning by a phone call from Harvey. "Her boyfriend called me this morning at about 3 and told me Cheryl was cramping heavily. I told him to put her in a tub of hot water. He called back a little later to say she was unconscious. I told him to get her to the hospital at once and I would meet them there. When she arrived, I started intravenous fluids and a blood transfusion, but she's gone." Carol was stunned, but she followed Harvey's instructions to just go about the day's business, but to pull Cheryl's chart and keep it at her office. So they went about their normal routine at the clinic, but Carol's thoughts were elsewhere. And at first her thoughts were of the woman's children who were left motherless, but then came near panic over what this death would mean for Carol Everett. Would there be bad publicity? Would the clinic be closed? How could they recover from this publicity blow? So that night, Carol discussed the situation with Harvey again, and he told her that since the boyfriend didn't want the woman's family to know about the abortion, he'd spoken with them and told them that he'd been treating Cheryl for a gynecological problem. They asked him flat out if she'd had an abortion, and he told her no. He told them no. So Harvey had done the damage control, Carol said. Nobody at the hospital would say anything to anybody about the death. Harvey's private practice and the clinic would be fine as long as they could keep the story from getting any publicity. And, Carol said, Harvey and his girlfriend carefully edited the patient chart before providing it to the medical examiner's office. The autopsy found that Cheryl had died of hemorrhage from a cervical tear. At this news, Carol said, I went numb. We could have saved Cheryl's life, my mind screamed. We only needed to have sutured her cervix. We had everything we needed in the clinic to save Cheryl's life, with one exception: a doctor willing to take the time to re-examine his patient to determine the cause of the bleeding. But he had a date, and the margaritas were waiting. Now, of course, pro-lifers are going to just believe Carol's story, and the abortion advocates are going to just poo-poo the whole thing. But there is another option between uncritical acceptance and contemptuous dismissal: looking into the story and seeing if it's true. Now, at Life Dynamics, we knew we couldn't just use the story out of Carol's book when we did our research for Line 5. We needed what we called a secular source, something more than some pro-lifer claiming that something had happened. So as we did with all stories we got from pro-lifers, we started searching for a public record document to verify Carol's story. Now, we knew that Carol's abortion facilities were in Dallas. Elsewhere in Blood Money, Carol indicated that as of January of 1982, she was still proud of her clinics, which had recently expanded to doing later abortions. And elsewhere, she said that to celebrate the boost in business that accompanied the expansion into later abortion, she bought a new car on March 2nd of 1982. And the next date we could get a clue from is Harvey's marriage, which took place February the following year. So we figured that the woman Carol called Cheryl must have died in 1982. So we started searching every public record source in the Dallas Metroplex area for an abortion death in 1982, and we found it. Autopsy report case number 0120-82-0057. 34-year-old Sherry Graham was pronounced dead January 16, 1982, at an emergency room in Dallas. She had a 3-centimeter tear in her cervix. Quote, "It is our opinion that Sherry died as a result of a laceration to the uterine cervix. By history, she had undergone a termination of pregnancy procedure the day prior to death. Evidence of bleeding included large amounts of blood on 3 cloth robes that accompanied the body and hemorrhage beneath the outer covering of the uterus." The address of the facility where Sherry had her abortion was the address of one of Carol's clinics. Now, of course, there's no public record document that's going to verify the story of the pitcher of margaritas, but when we consider what excuses other abortionists had for leaving patients with no medical supervision, the pitcher of margaritas story is credible. John Biskind left Luann Heron without medical supervision so he could keep an appointment with a tailor. She bled to death in the clinic. There was no reason given for Abram Zelikman's decision to leave the hemorrhaging Euris Agbaga in the care of a receptionist. Euris also bled to death. Tommy Tucker seemed to have left Angela Hall with no doctor to care for her because he'd had a fight with the nurse about whether or not to call an ambulance. Angela died of multiple complications. Bruce Steer left Sharon Hamplin in the care of ill-trained staff who plunked the hemorrhaging woman into a wheelchair and pushed her out the door. She bled to death on the drive home. Steer had left because he was moving on. He was a circuit rider and he was going to another clinic. And Naresh Kumar Patel was reprimanded by the Oklahoma Medical Board for leaving a patient in post-operative condition in the treatment room under anesthesia so that he could take a friend to the airport. Now, Carol places responsibility for the death of the woman she calls Cheryl not only on Johnson's shoulders, but squarely on her own. She herself began laying the groundwork for what would happen to Cheryl with a business decision to do later abortions because of their higher profit margin. So, this is, again, something that I really wish I could get pro-choicers to care about, to understand that the abortion clinic has a laser focus on the fetus. Once it's dead, the woman often becomes invisible to them. It's just like they wash their hands of her. You see so many cases of lack of observation in the recovery room. They just throw the woman in a recliner and leave her there with no monitoring equipment, no nurse, and they'll saunter by 45 minutes later and notice she's not breathing. It's appalling. And the reason this channel is called the Sisyphean Journal is like it's pushing a rock up a hill. Like, it will start to seem like abortion supporters will actually care about what goes on in these abortion clinics. There'll be some story like the Gosnell story, and there'll be the, ooh, all is not well in Sunshine and Unicorns Land, and it's like 10 minutes later they're back, no problem, everything's beautiful. There's nothing to see here. All abortion practitioners are totally trustworthy, wonderful people. You don't need state oversight. They would never do a bad thing. They're wonderful. They're lovely. And like I said, I've said it before, I'm beginning to think it's, what's it called? Mass formation, where the cause becomes so important and defeating the perceived enemy becomes so important that people become willing to sacrifice everything they love for their cause and for the defeat of their perceived enemy, even when they wind up effectively harming themselves and the people they love. And that's what the case seems to be with abortion. Once people become enamored of this practice, the women themselves just stop mattering. And I wish I could change that.